Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Pulitzer Prize-winning author Paul Harding's new novel, This Other Eden, is inspired by the true story of Malaga Island, an isolated island off the coast of Maine that became one of the first racially integrated towns in the Northeast. In 1792, formerly enslaved Benjamin Honey and his Irish wife Patience discover an island where they can make a life together. Over a century later, the Honey's descendants and a diverse group of neighbors are desperately poor, isolated, and often hungry. In 1912, a missionary comes and decides to forcibly evacuate the island, institutionalize its residents, and develop the island as a vacation destination. Paul Harding is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Tinkers and Enon. He is the director of the MFA in Creative Writing and Literature at Stony Brook University. The new novel is This Other Eden, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Paul Harding back to this week's book show. Paul, thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, thanks so much. It's a delight to be back on the program.
Well, I loved this novel so much. It's an amazing story. Give me a sense of how you came to it and fleshed it out to the point of the beautiful story that you render here.
Well, I was in search of a new novel to write, and so I was kind of fooling around with some elements of my second novel, Enon. So purely fictional, purely imagined. But in the course of just reading what I read and knocking around and sifting around, I ended up reading a book about the history of organized labor in the United States after the Civil War. And it just occurred to me at some point that there must have been either all Black and or integrated communities after the Civil War. So I just Googled, integrated community, Civil War, something like that. And of course, it's one of these things that it doesn't occur to you until it does. And when it does, it's there. It exists in reality. There were any number of these integrated communities kind of sort of all around the country. And pretty quickly, I came upon the story of a place called Malaga Island, which is off the southern coast of Maine, that was the site of a racially integrated community settlement from about 1792 or 1793 until the government of Maine, the state of Maine, had the community, members of the community evicted in the summer of 1912. In my first book, Tinkers, I wrote about Maine. My grandparents are from Maine, so that interested me. Then as I read a little bit more about Malaga Island, I discovered that one of the families there was actually committed to a place called the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, quite a euphemism, which had sort of served as a model for a kind of asylum that one of the characters in Tinkers was under threat of being committed to. So I thought that's another point of connection. The historical detail that sealed the deal for me was that to the month and maybe almost to the week of the eviction, the first International Congress for Eugenics was occurring in London. And I just thought, that's the whole thing just laid claim to my imagination. But I also quickly realized that I didn't want to write an historical novel per se. I didn't want to take the real historical figures from the island and write sort of fictionalized biographies of them.
So instead, we read about Benjamin Honey, who was formerly enslaved, his Irish wife, Patience, who discover the island where they can make a life together. Ultimately, it is their descendants and other neighbors who are thrown off of the island come 1912 and in that summer. Let's start with the Honeys, with Benjamin and Patience, starting that life of what they were looking for.
So in the historical figure, the guy, it was named Benjamin Darling, and so he was either a freed or escaped, formerly enslaved Black man, and his wife Patience was from Galway, Ireland. It just seems so sort of Edenic in a certain way, just the sense of there's this island and there's only two people on it, and it's this man and this woman. And the presumption is that they end up founding this community that lasts for over a century. It was such a germ, it was so simple. And I loved the idea of just letting it unfold and elaborate itself. And again, imaginatively, because the minute I thought, oh, they're on an island, so that's almost like it's almost like Noah and his wife. It's almost like, when the community is a little larger, it's almost like all the sailors on the Pequod and Moby Dick. The island is almost like the island in The Tempest. It was so suggestive to me and elusive, and particularly literarily, that I just dove in and was, sort of completely taken up with these people's lives for the better part of 10 years.
How free did you want to be from the facts, in the sense of, once you have the characters and once you have they're inhabiting the island, you know the story, the true story that got them there and the true story that will take them from the island, but the day-to-day life was your imagination?
Largely, I did realize very quickly that I wanted to tell an imagined version of what came to me to seem more and more a kind of almost universal kind of plot or human predicament of displacement. And so I didn't do much research at all. I think after reading a couple or three articles about Malaga and taking some of the facts as kind of like load bearing premises, but I really immediately began to try to come up, detach and make my own imagined version of the story.
It seems that the idea of telling the story here, other than the historical aspect, is what's so wonderful about the novel, because it is a really snapshots, if you will, of the living, of those who are living on this island and their relationship with one another, and you go in and you listen to them and you learn about them, and then you learn about someone else.
To me, the most interesting thing were the people and their relationships and their sort of day-to-day life. I mean, as a novelist, you always want to build up character. You want people that seem like people from real life. And it was also just a matter of emphasis. What was important to me was these people's lives, and then the sort of the calamity that befalls them. It was a given that it was going to happen, but it seemed to me that everybody sort of intellectually knows it's terrible, it's unjust, it's a calamity, it's awful. But I feel like the reader would have more a sense of the real human consequences of the calamity if you spent most of the book with the people themselves, because then you would have a greater sense of the weight and the value and the humanity that was lost in that calamity.
I mean, it's safe to say that we always know a calamity is coming, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the first time that I dealt with any kind of material that was based in history, and so that, like with any historical novel, you presume that by the time the reader reads the the copy on the back flap of the book or the cover of the book, they know what the plot is. So then, I mean, to me, that's always interesting. It's a challenge to you start, and if most of the readers know how the plot is going to end, then it's incumbent upon the writer the story will be in the telling then.
I'm interested in how much, even as you were putting this together, of that first International Eugenics Congress, as that was happening in London, of how much that interested you and what impact it had on the timing and the story itself.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating to me. I'm sort of an armchair science junkie. I subscribe to Science Magazine and Nature Magazine, and it's always interesting to see or to feel like you detect sort of the persistence of this kind of impulse towards eugenics, which is basically it's ideology kind of masking itself behind hiding behind the imprimatur of the label or term science, that the authority of science, when we all know that science is as vulnerable to misadventure and human abuse as anything else, which is to say utterly. And so you look at the kind of the prose and the idiom of the writing that you found at the time about eugenics, and it's just chilling. It's just so sort of grotesque and dehumanizing, and yet so sort of plumed up with its own authority. And really, it's just bigotry. It's just sort of naked bigotry.
When you started to think about the characters and who you were going to tell about and who you were going to focus on, it brings for this amazing cast of characters that are so real and are so full. And I'm interested in even given the sort of the bookends of where they come into the story and when they leave the story, as to how you set that up so that it does work to a point of, we know that they're coming into this moment of calamity.
Yeah, it was interesting. Over the years of writing, I sort of ended up kind of starting off with this sort of ensemble pieces and just this almost like very elaborated, cast of characters, and just sort of kind of elaborating who they are and kind of blocking out what their basic situations were. And then over time, I would spend more and more time. I'd sort of go off and spend, let's go. And I want to spend some time with Esther Honey, who's sort of the matriarch of the island. And then I want to spend some time with this guy, Zachary Hand to God Proverbs, who was a Civil War veteran. He's a black guy, and he sort of lives in a tree and carves the inside of the tree. And sort of just one by one, each of these people that I saw in kind of an ensemble cast, I started sort of letting them take their solos or their arias, as it were. And there's over time, there's kind of elaborated this kind of form to the novel where they're all there as a group, but then they each almost have a turn as a protagonist, or as a version of a protagonist in the story. And like you said, some of the characters, they come on stage and they're in the novel for a good amount of it, and then they just sort of walk past the margins of the stage, like people do in our own lives. People kind of come in and out of our own lives. So that that was just one of those pleasant surprises. I just thought, wow, I could have never thought that up ahead of time, but I really like the way it works. How the book sort of keeps handing the reader off, to now look at it from this point of view. Now look at it from that point of view. I think it's also a way of just directing the reader about who's ultimately important and who is ultimately of secondary or tertiary importance.
You very casually mentioned the fact that Zachary Handegod lives in a tree, and you would think, I think most people would think when you said that he lives up in the tree, but no, he actually lives in the tree, in the trunk of the tree. That's what's so fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those things that, as a writer, it's like you figure out ways to have your cake and eat it too. And when I was just starting to kind of invoke Zachary, I had just been up in Toronto at I can't remember the museum, some museum up in Toronto, and they just happened to have this exhibit of these incredibly intricate sculptures made out of ivory. And they were just these sort of bands, these sort of layers and stratas of, like, they looked like galleries that were in which biblical scenes were, I think they were biblical scenes were carved. And I just thought, oh, I want some of those ivory carvings for my book. How can I get that? So I thought, well, we'll get the guy in the tree and we'll see if we can have him do that in the tree. And it's just like, it was just a joy to make those carvings, and a joy to sort of end up invoking his joy in the way that he's taken up with these carvings.
Tell us about Ethan. It was probably my favorite part of the book, about his process as an artist, the love story that ensues, and it's some of the most beautiful writing that is in the book. I think it's just gorgeous.
That's another one of those things that, for the longest time, that part of the book, it didn't quite fit. It didn't quite attain its own kind of little, autonomy within the larger book, and it didn't quite connect with the larger book. I think I eventually figured out a way to do it, but it took a long time. That part in the book, that was the original part of the book. That's where I had started, which was it's set, in this sort of meadow on this estate in a town called Enon, which is the eponymous name of my second novel. And I had just started writing, trying to almost doodle kind of scenes, a scene in the meadow. And eventually I was talking about, my reading, and I'm just such a magpie. I was reading about, I love still life and landscape painting. And I was reading about an American artist named Charles Ethan Porter, black guy who was who's active around the end of the 19th century. And I came upon this beautiful painting he has of haystacks in a meadow. And so I thought, I don't know who or what this is going to be, but I just put a guy out in the background of this scene I was working on who was just like a painter off in the meadow. And one of the characters very early on said, who's that guy? And as I worked up the other, some of the other material, I realized whoever he is, he's from this island, this Apple Island, which is my version of Malaga Island. And so I just ended up, just discovering that he was this character, Ethan, and that evolved. And then he ends up having this romance with the Irish housekeeper, young girl named Bridget. And what ended up happening was that I realized that sort of that part of the story could be sort of subtitled "This Other Eden." It's almost like they have this little Edenic but sort of star-crossed love affair in this kind of meadow. And then as, the kind of catastrophe starts to preveniently, precipitate over the horizon, they are sort of both cast out of this temporary, but nevertheless, wonderful romance in this world that they enjoy together for a brief period.
That is a fascinating relationship because Bridget ultimately doesn't realize that Ethan is black. He's very light skinned, and that comes to her much later of learning that fact.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that really, really put the barb in my imagination was I think it was the first thing I ever read about Malaga. I think it was an article about it in Down East magazine, like in 1980 or something like that. And the article was accompanied by photographs. Somebody had photographed people on the island, and one of the most striking photographs was that there's a school on the island that, in historical fact, was highly regarded enough to the point that people from some of the surrounding communities would pay a small tuition to have their children attend this school. And so the picture of the school children is of children who range in skin tone from the most Caucasian of Caucasian to the most apparent, black, kind of African, and everything in between. And I just, and these kids were dressed in these what looked to us like old-fashioned garb, dresses, and breeches with suspenders and all of it. But there they all were together and intermixed, and it was just so striking. So I sort of gave that photograph to Bridget, and she sees Ethan, who presents as white, and she puzzles over it until it, in the book, it dawns on her what the situation is, that he's a mixed race kid.
How interested were you in writing about race specifically, or is it something that you wanted to be more in the background and of the understanding without having an audience read it with today's sensibilities of race?
Yeah, that was one of the, one of the, sort of hallmarks of quality control is when I come upon something and I think I would really like to write about this. And that's my first impulse. And my second impulse is don't do it. It'll be too difficult. It'll be too, it's just like, don't step into that. And I just think, so that then you kind of have to, because then the sense of like, why bother making art if you're putting less than everything at stake? On the one hand, race in itself, I just don't accept it because it's a kind of cultural persistence of an initially scientifically specious bit of theory, right? But if it's real, if people act as if it's real, so culturally it is, it predominates in a lot of our lives. And I started to think about that. So I think as a novelist, if you start writing about race per se, if race is ever the subject in and of itself, it's almost impossible to get human beings out from under that. But if you start with human beings, just individual people, you meet one by one and you pay them the courtesy and the dignity of, each has his or their own integrity, and they account for themselves and they begin to elaborate themselves. Then I was able to sort of, the scenes that are set on the island, it's just these people who love one another and exasperate one another and negotiate with one another, and they kind of get along. They all communally help each other get through life. And then whenever the point of view leaves the island, then you start getting racialized language in this way where the humanity of these people becomes predicates, or they become objectified because the subject is race, and you start getting all this, evaluative nonsense, and that's where you get craniometry and all these kind of, again, crackpot, but at the time considered legitimate sort of pseudo-anthropological kind of measurements of human worth. So yeah, that's that. I think that's the thing, is you just race, just because of the way everything worked in this book. Race is the subject that some of the characters think about, particularly the people who boot the people off the island, but the novel itself had to be about these people first, and then they end up kind of, again, catastrophically running into, race as a subject that, and as a prevailing subject in U.S. history.
Paul Harding is our guest. The name of the new novel is This Other Eden. The book is published by Norton. We talk about calamity, we talk about catastrophe, and the last section of the book is, as the island is just being decimated, is really, I mean, it's tough stuff, obviously, and I'm curious as to what it was like to write that and to have it in such a vivid way, and really, as we were talking about earlier, of sort of watching it from beyond, of looking down and seeing what's happening.
Yeah, and that was another aspect of writing the novel. It just took a long time, and to be very careful and to think about it. And I got it wrong any number of times, and because so much of working on something for years and years and years is sort of just sifting through, so that, I got to the point where I basically know every single sentence in the book, and everything has to be, I think of it as like putting a Swiss watch together. It's like very, very, to be perfectly calibrated, perfectly balanced, because the wrong proportion of anything could set everything else out of whack, out of kilter. And so this goes back to what we were kind of talking about earlier, which is everybody knows the calamity is going to happen. And so when it happens, it doesn't take up many pages. The actual eviction, kind of naturally, and arrives towards the end of the book. But again, I didn't want to linger over it, because there was just one syllable too long, one beat too many, and it becomes gratuitous. And again, it kind of tied in what we were talking about, which is this is about these people. These people are the subjects. They are the proper subjects. These souls to whom this happened. And I felt very strongly about, if I lingered too long on the calamity, then the strongest emotion in the book ends up being almost like the reader's indignation, and it could very easily become sensationalistic. It could easily become gratuitous, and then the book would almost invite a kind of objectification, the exact kind of objectification that it was lamenting. You have to be careful about that sort of thing, because you don't want it to then end up just being about the righteousness of the emotional indignation of the reader, because that's not what the book is about. But nevertheless, there it was. So I found a way to portray it in what is, I think it's imagined, but it's terrible. It's quite awful, but it's not again, it's not lingered over.
I was fascinated by the New York Times piece about you, because there are 4 photos included of your notebooks. And it is fascinating, just fascinating. And I invite everyone who's listening to look it up and just put Paul Harding New York Times, and you'll see that there are these 4 pictures of your notebooks that from your novels. I have 2 ways of asking this question. One is that normal? I've known a lot of authors have never seen it like that, but also, how do you keep track of that? Because these are it's a lot of handwriting. It is a lot of Post-it notes. It's a lot of color coding, and a way that I guess is ultimately organization.
It's very funny, because I am not as they would say in the biz, a systematic theologian. I am just kind of discursive, and the metaphor I use is that I'm like one of those little robot vacuum cleaners. I just sort of randomly bounce around, but eventually I sort of cover all the territory. I think part of it is that I've come to think of myself as I'm just writing all the time. I'm just not always typing or actually writing, but I'm always thinking about things. And so I often just write there's a good line for that character, or that's an interesting word, or that's what I think she would say, or these little revelations, on like a line level basis. And so I just write them down on the nearest handy piece of paper, and then I just sort of scoop up these nests of Post-its and napkins and receipts and stuff. Like I've stapled them into the notebooks and then write all around them. And it almost becomes a kind of cool little artifact in and of itself. They end up being these interesting little archaeological kind of records of all the strata of the stories and that kind of stuff. And I just find that pleasant. It's a pleasant way to work. I mean, I certainly have, I don't think it happened with this one. It might have. I don't. But with certainly with Tinkers and Enon, after Tinkers was published, I found like an entire box of just papers and sheafs and little notes and stuff, all of which I was like, geez, I would have liked to have put that in the book. I forgot I even wrote those things. So I just go around in this big kind of like scarf. I'm just scarfed in, all of these things that I was trying to kind of tessellate them together, but it's very quirky, but it also works for me. I have kind of a sort of ultimately productive kind of inefficiency with this sort of stuff. It forces me to go through everything over and over and over and over and over again. That's kind of a way of vetting things and revising them and making sure they're kind of earning their weight.
Paul Harding's new novel is This Other Eden. It is published by Norton. Paul, what a great pleasure to have you back on the program. Thank you so much for being with us. A delight to speak with you.
Oh, thank you for having me back. It was a wonderful time.
Again, the name of the book is This Other Eden by Paul Harding. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week.